The air inside the alien temple was heavy, filled with the smell of burning incense and old blood. Massive stone pillars rose high into the shadows, carved with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the flickering torchlight. Chains hung from the ceiling, swaying gently as if touched by an unseen wind. In the center of the long stone path, a human warrior was dragged forward by two towering alien guards. His feet scraped against the rough ground, leaving a trail of blood behind him. The warrior's face was pale, his breathing shallow, but his eyes still burned with defiance. His body was covered in cuts and bruises, his torn armor barely clinging to his frame. Every step sent pain shooting through him, yet he refused to cry out. Around him, hundreds of alien spectators stood in silence, their glowing eyes watching every movement. They had gathered to see the sacrifice, the ritual that their people believed would bring them victory in the war. Above them all, at the far end of the temple, stood the altar, ancient slab of black stone, smooth from centuries of bloodshed. Behind it, the high priest waited, dressed in robes of deep crimson and gold. In his hands, he held a ceremonial blade, its edge shining with a cold, deadly light. The crowd began to hum in a low, rhythmic tone, a sound that seemed to crawl into the warrior's bones. The warrior knew what was coming. He had seen the altar before, though never this close. He had heard the stories from other prisoners how no one ever left it alive. Still, he held his head high. If this was his end, he would face it standing, not on his knees, but somewhere in the shadows, unseen by the guards. Someone else was watching. The alien prophetess stood near one of the great pillars, her eyes locked on the human. Her skin shimmered faintly under the torchlight, a sign of her high status among her people. Long dark hair framed her face, and her ceremonial robes flowed around her like liquid gold. But her expression was not one of cold triumph, like the others. Her hands were tense at her sides, and her gaze was filled with something rare among her kind conflict. She had seen this moment before. In the sacred flames of her visions, she had watched the human walk the path to the altar. But the visions had not ended with his death. In them, she saw him standing beside her, alive, and holding something that could change the fate of their worlds. Yet here he was, about to die, and she was surrounded by those who would kill her for speaking against the old ways. The guards reached the altar and forced the human to his knees. The high priest raised the blade slowly, turning so that all could see. The humming of the crowd grew louder, vibrating through the air. The human stared at the priest without fear, though every muscle in his body screamed in pain. The prophetess felt her heartbeat quicken. The visions burned in her mind, again images of fire, stars, and the human's eyes looking back at her as if he knew her soul. She had been taught that the stars never lied, and if they had shown her this man alive, then letting him die would be a betrayal not just to him, but to destiny itself. Her breath caught as the high priest stepped forward, the blade now hovering over the human's neck. The crowd waited for the strike. The warrior closed his eyes, ready for the end, and then stop. Her voice cut through the humming like a blade. Every head turned toward her. The guards froze. The high priest's hand trembled slightly before he slowly lowered the blade, his eyes narrowing in confusion and anger. The prophetess walked forward, her footsteps echoing in the silent hall. She met the high priest's gaze without fear. "This sacrifice is forbidden," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the temple. "The stars have spoken. His life is not ours to take." Gasps rippled through the crowd. No one had ever dared to challenge the high priest during a ritual. The human opened his eyes and stared at her, unsure if she was real or some final dream before death. The high priest's voice was cold. "You dare speak against the gods?" "Speak for them," she answered, her tone steady. "And they command that this man must live." The silence that followed was heavy, like the moment before a storm. The high priest's grip on the blade tightened. The crowd waited to see if blood would still be Spilder's or the humans. The warrior, still on his knees, did not understand why this alien woman would risk her life for him. But something in her eyes told him she meant every word. For the first time since his capture, a spark of hope flickered in his heart. The temple still held its breath. The prophetess stood in the open space before the altar, her golden robes catching the flicker of the torches. The high priest stared at her as if he could strike her down with his eyes alone. The guards shifted uneasily, their hands still gripping. The human's arms, unsure whether to follow the old law or the sudden command from the one who claimed to speak for the stars. Her heart pounded, but she did not let it show. This was not the first time she had stood against the priesthood, but it was the first time she had done it in front of the entire council and the gathered warriors. The risk was great, yet the fire in her mind was greater 2 nights ago. She had knelt before the sacred flames in her private chamber. The fire had burned in strange colors, blue at the heart, streaks of silver twisting upward. That was when the visions began. She had seen a battlefield, lit not by the red suns of their world, but by cold white stars. She had seen herself standing beside the human now kneeling before her, their backs against each other as shadows closed in, and in her hands she had held something more powerful than any weapon, a sphere of light that pulsed like a living heart. The vision had not shown the end, but she had felt it deep within her bones. This human was the turning point. If he lived, the future shifted. If he died, all would fall into darkness. That was why she was here. Her voice cutting through the ancient chant. The high priest lowered the blade slowly, but his face hardened. "Your visions are not the law," he said, his voice heavy with warning. "The gods demand this sacrifice. Without it, our warriors will go to battle unblessed." She met his gaze without blinking. "Without him," she replied, "your warriors will go to battle and never return." A murmur swept through the crowd. Superstition ran deep in her people, and even the most hardened soldier hesitated when the stars were invoked. The guard's grips on the human loosened, just slightly, but not enough to free him. The human looked from her to the high priest, trying to make sense of their words. He didn't understand their language fully, but the tone was enough to tell him that the woman in gold was standing between him and death. The high priest stepped down from the altar, closing the distance between them. His voice dropped low, so only she could hear. "You play a dangerous game, seer. This man is nothing. He is prey that wandered into the hunter's snare. You risk everything for him." "I risk nothing," she whispered back. "It is you who risk defying the will of the stars." Their eyes locked for a long, tense moment. Then the high priest stepped back, raising his hands to the crowd. "The prophetess claims the stars forbid this sacrifice," he announced. "We shall see if the stars will protect her when she bears the burden of this man's life." The hum of the crowd began. Again, softer this time, filled with unease. The guards looked to the high priest, then to the prophetess. At last, the priest gave a sharp nod. The chains were not removed, but the human was no longer forced to the altar. Instead, the guards dragged him to the side, where he knelt at the prophetess's feet. She turned to face him, lowering herself so their eyes met. Up close, she could see the stubborn strength in his gaze, the silent promise that he would not break, no matter what they did to him. "You do not know me," she said softly in her language, knowing he would not understand the words, but perhaps the feeling. "But I know you. I saw you before I ever met you. I saw you in the fire, standing where no human has stood before." The human's brow furrowed slightly, as if sensing the weight in her voice. She reached for the pouch at her side and drew out a small fragment of crystal. It glowed faintly in the torchlight, and for a moment, it seemed to answer the warmth of her hand. She placed it against the human's chest, just over his heart. The glow deepened. The high priest's eyes narrowed at the sight. The crowd leaned forward, whispering. "This is the mark of the chosen," the prophetess said, her voice rising so all could hear. "No blade will touch him while it shines." The murmurs grew louder, now mixed with awe and fear. No one dared challenge the old prophecies, and to see the crystal glow was rare to dismiss. The high priest's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the altar, his robes trailing behind him like a dark shadow. The prophetess straightened and gave the smallest of nods to the guards. Reluctantly, they stepped back. The human was still chained, still weak, but now he was no longer at the mercy of the blade. She knew this was only the first step. The priesthood would not forget this day. They would wait for her to make a mistake. They would wait for the glow of the crystal to fade. But for now, the human lived, and in the silent place inside her heart. She swore he would keep living long enough for the vision to come true. The human's knees ached against the cold stone floor. His wrists throbbed under the weight of the chains. The skin rubbed raw where iron bit into flesh. The prophetess stood before him, her golden robes brushing against the dust, her presence like a fragile shield between him and the dozens of alien warriors staring from the shadows. The high priest still lingered near the altar, his hands gripping the ceremonial blade as if it were part of him. His eyes were fixed on the prophetess, his expression unreadable but full of warning. The silence in the temple was deep, broken only by the faint crackle of the torches and the slow drip of water from the high ceiling. The human tried to push himself upright, but the chains dragged him down. His breathing came heavy, each breath stirring the dust at his feet. He had fought in battles before on ruined streets, in burning forests, aboard broken ships, but never had his fate hung on the voice of someone he didn't know. The prophetess turned her head slightly, glancing toward the high priest. She knew she couldn't simply walk away with the human. The crowd needed a reason to let him live, and not just for today. Without that reason, he would be hunted the moment they left the temple. She stepped forward, her voice carrying a cross. "The great hall, I will take responsibility for him." Gasps rippled through the gathering. It was one thing to stop a sacrifice. It was another to claim the life that should have been given to the gods. In their culture, such a claim was a binding oath, one that tied her fate to his. If he committed a crime, she would bear the punishment. If he died dishonorably, her name would be cursed for generations. The high priest's lips curled into a slow smile. "You speak as if you are ready to pay for his life with your own." "I am," she said simply. The human didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. There was steel in her voice. It wasn't the tone of someone trying to gain favor or prove a point. It was the tone of someone who had already decided what they would die for. The high priest descended the altar steps, the ceremonial blade glinting in his grip. He stopped just a few paces from them. "You will plead for him before the council at sunrise," he said. "If they reject your claim, the sacrifice will be completed. And this time, the stars will not save you." The prophetess inclined her head, a gesture of respect that hid her anger. "So be it." Two guards stepped forward, intending to drag the human away to the holding pits, but she raised her hand. "He stays with me tonight." The high priest's eyes narrowed. "You think I will let you guard him alone?" "I think," she replied, "that if you touch him again before sunrise, the gods will see it as breaking the challenge you have given me, and the council will know." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, with a small gesture, the high priest signaled the guards to step back. "Keep him, Prophetess," he said at last. "But remember, you have bound yourself to him. When he falls, so will you." The Prophetess turned to the human, motioning for the guards to unlock part of his chains so he could walk. The cuffs around his wrists remained, but the long binding chain was removed. She guided him away from the altar, their footsteps echoing in the great hall as the crowd watched in silence. They passed through tall stone doors into a dim corridor lit by narrow slits in the wall where moonlight spilled through. The air here was cooler, but heavy with the scent of old incense. The human's legs threatened to give way, but she steadied him with one hand against his arm. When they reached her private chambers, she closed the heavy door and locked it from the inside. Only then did she turn to face him fully. "You don't understand my words," she said softly, switching to her own language. "But you will understand this tonight. You live. Tomorrow, we fight for you to keep living." The human studied her face. He didn't need her language to read the truth in her eyes. Whatever she had done in that temple, it had put her in danger too. He tried to speak, but his voice was rough and low. "Why?" She hesitated. She could have told him it was destiny. She could have told him the stars demanded it, but instead, she simply said, "Because the world has enough blood, and yours is not meant to be spilled here." She brought a small bowl of water and a strip of clean cloth, kneeling to clean the wounds on his arms. He flinched at first, unused to such care from one of her kind, but she worked gently, her touch firm and certain. As she worked, she thought of the flames, how they had shown her his face again and again, until she could no longer pretend it was a trick of her mind. The vision had burned itself into her soul. And now that he was here, flesh and blood, before her, she knew she had done the only thing she could. But she also knew the truth. Saving him once was not enough. The council would not be swayed easily. Tomorrow, she would have to stand before them and speak words that could cost her everything. The human watched her in silence, his eyes following every movement of her hands. Somewhere deep inside, the thought stirred: this alien woman had chosen to stand against her entire world for him, and though he did not yet know why, he felt something he hadn't felt since his capture. Hope. The night outside the prophetess's chamber was silent. But it was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of watching eyes, of guards standing in shadow, of enemies waiting for a single mistake. The human sat on the floor near the low fire pit, the faint warmth brushing against his torn armor. The cuffs around his wrists still bound him, the metal cold against his skin. He had been a prisoner long enough to know what that meant. He was not truly free. Not yet. The prophetess stood near the small window slit, her eyes fixed on the moons hanging above the alien city. Their pale light painted the rooftops in silver, making the spires and towers look like jagged teeth. Somewhere beyond those walls, the council chamber waited. By dawn, she would have to face them, and she knew they would not welcome her defiance. She turned back to him. "They will try to take you before morning," she said, in her own language, knowing he wouldn't understand the words, but perhaps the tone. "If they succeed, I won't get you back." The human met her eyes, his jaw tightening. He didn't know the details, but he understood enough. This night was dangerous. She walked to a carved chest against the wall and opened it. Inside lay old ceremonial items, robes, jewelry, relics of her station. But beneath them, hidden under folded cloth, she pulled out a narrow metal tool. It was no weapon, but it could open a lock. Kneeling in front of him, she reached for his wrists. The tool slid into the cuff's mechanism with practiced ease. Her fingers worked quickly. The tiny clicks of the lock almost lost under the sound of the fire's crackle. The human watched her face. There was no hesitation in her movements. Whatever her reasons, she had decided this before the night even began. One cuff gave way with a sharp snap. She moved to the second. But before the lock could release, a heavy knock echoed from the door. Her head snapped up. The firelight caught the brief flash of alarm in her eyes. She pressed a finger to her lips, urging him to be silent. The voice outside was deep and commanding. "Prophetess, the high priest sends word. The council will meet before first light. Bring the human." She rose and called back in a steady tone. "He will be brought when the stars demand it. Leave us." Silence followed. Then footsteps retreated, but too slowly. She knew they hadn't gone far. Turning back to him, she worked the lock faster. The second cuff sprang open, and for the first time since his capture, his hands were free. He rubbed his wrists, feeling the rush of blood back into them. She stood and motioned for him to follow. "We go now," she said softly. They moved toward the back wall where a heavy tapestry hung. Behind it, a narrow stone doorway led into a hidden passage, the air cool and smelling of earth. The steps were uneven, worn by centuries of use. The human followed close, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The passage wound downward, lit only by the faint glow of her robe's embroidery. Somewhere above them, a door slammed open. Voices shouted in the temple hall. The guards had realized she was moving him without permission. She picked up the pace, the passage twisting left and right until it opened into a small chamber. In the center stood a sealed gate made of old iron. She pressed her hand to a stone plate beside it, and the gate slid open with a low groan. Beyond lay the outer ruins, broken pillars and crumbling walls swallowed by moonlit mist. The city's lights burned in the distance, but here shadows ruled. The human hesitated, glancing back toward the passage they'd come from. She shook her head. No time. They stepped into the ruins. The wind was sharp, carrying the distant sound of horns and alarm. The guards were spreading out. The prophetess led him through the skeletal remains of what had once been a great courtyard. Statues of alien warriors stood in cracked rows, their features worn away by time. She moved with the precision of someone who had walked this path before. But as they reached a collapsed archway, movement caught her Aja figure stepping out from behind a fallen column. Then another, and another. 3 alien warriors, armed and armored, blocked their path. The human's muscles tensed. He had no weapon, but he still had his fists and his will to fight. One of the warriors sneered, "The council will want to see him, alive or dead." The prophetess stepped forward, her voice cold. "If you touch him, you break the high priest's challenge. Do you wish to bring his wrath on yourselves?" The warriors hesitated. They feared the high priest, but they also feared losing their prize. The human moved to stand beside her, his shoulders squared. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. This was a standoff. Finally, the lead warrior stepped aside, motioning to the others. "Go then, but you will not get far." She didn't wait to see if they would change their minds. She grabbed the human's arm and led him deeper into the ruins, vanishing into the mist. Somewhere ahead, beyond the broken stones, there was a path out of the city. But she knew their pursuers would follow. The chains were gone. The escape had begun. And now, every step they took was a step into the unknown. The wind howled through the shattered arches as the prophetess led the human deeper into the ruins. Moonlight spilled across broken stones, casting long, jagged shadows that shifted with every movement. Somewhere behind them, voices called out in the alien tongue, sharp, commanding, and closing in. The human's bare feet slipped against loose gravel, but he kept moving. His breath came in short bursts, the cool night air stinging his lungs. Every step sent a dull ache through his legs, but he pushed the pain down. He had been close to death before, but never this close. Never with so little between him and the edge. The prophetess glanced back, her eyes scanning the shadows. She could hear the faint clink of armor from the pursuit. They were gaining. "Faster," she urged, her voice low but urgent. They ducked under a fallen pillar, its surface carved, with symbols so old even she couldn't read them anymore. Beyond it lay a narrow alley of stone, once a corridor of the ancient temple grounds. Now nothing more than a jagged scar in the earth. The human followed her through, the rough stone scraping against his arms. The alley opened into a wide courtyard, its center dominated by a cracked fountain. Water no longer flowed there. Instead, a nest of weeds grew in the basin, swaying in the wind. From the left, the sound of boots pounding on stone. From the right, the faint glow of torchlight. They were being boxed in. The prophetess didn't hesitate. She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward a section of the outer wall where part of it had crumbled away, leaving only a narrow climb up jagged rocks. The human understood without words up was their only chance. He began climbing, the stone cold and rough beneath his fingers. Loose gravel fell with every movement, clattering into the darkness below. The prophetess was right behind him, her robes snagging on sharp edges but never slowing her pace. Halfway up, a shout rang out below. An arrow whistled past, striking the wall just inches from the human's head. He gritted his teeth and climbed faster, ignoring the sharp sting as the rock tore at his skin. They reached the top and crouched low. Beyond the wall, the land fell away into a steep slope covered in thick, pale-leafed plants. The prophetess pointed downward. "That way," she said. The slope was treacherous, the plants slick with night dew. They slid more than they walked, their hands catching on branches and roots to slow the fall. The city lights disappeared behind them, swallowed by mist. When they finally reached the bottom, the air was colder. The land here was wild, untouched by the city's reach. Twisted trees rose around them, their limbs clawing at the night sky. Somewhere in the distance, a stream whispered through the darkness. The prophetess led him toward it, her steps sure despite the uneven ground. "Water will cover our trail," she explained softly, though she knew he couldn't understand. They reached the stream and stepped into its shallow current. The cold bit at their feet, but the sound of the flowing water masked their movements. They followed it for what felt like hours, the forest closing in around them. Only when the sounds of pursuit faded completely did they stopped to rest. The human sank onto a flat rock by the stream, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths. His muscles trembled from the effort of running and climbing. The prophetess knelt beside him, pulling a small pouch from her belt. She opened it and took out a handful of crushed leaves, their scent sharp and strange. She pressed them to a cut on his arm, the herb's coolness easing the sting. For a moment, the world was quiet. The water whispered, the leaves rustled in the wind, and the moons watched from above. The human looked at her, his voice rough. "We safe?" She met his eyes, understanding the question even without knowing all the words. "For now," she said, but in her heart, she knew the truth. This was only a pause, not an escape. The council would not stop. The high priest would not forgive, and the hunters they sent next would be faster, stronger, and far less willing to let them slip away. Still, she allowed herself one moment to breathe. One moment to believe that saving him had been the right choice. The human watched her, noting the way her gaze kept scanning the trees, the way her hand never strayed far from the hidden dagger in her robe. She was not just a rescuer, she was a fighter ready to defend what she had claimed. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this. If death came for him again, she would be standing in its way. And for the first time since the altar, he almost believed they could win. The stream's cold water slid past their feet, carrying away the scent of sweat and blood. Above, the twin moons hung low, casting pale light across the trees. The human sat on a flat rock near the bank, his shoulders slumped, his body trembling from exhaustion. The prophetess knelt beside him, her robe brushing the damp earth. She reached for the pouch at her belt, pulling out a strip of soft cloth. Without a word, she dipped it into the water, wrung it out, and began cleaning the deep cut on his arm. He flinched at the first touch, but she didn't stop. Her hands were steady, her fingers firm yet careful, as though she had done this many times before. The human studied her face in the moonlight. She was different from the others of her kind, not just in the way she had saved him, but in the way she looked at him. Most of her people had eyes like cold metal, their gazes filled with judgment or hunger. Hers held something else. A quiet fire, a certainty that she had chosen this path and would see it through. Why? He asked softly, his voice still rough from thirst and fatigue. She paused, her hand hovering over the wound. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into the pouch again and took out a bundle of crushed herbs. The scent was sharp and earthy as she pressed it to his arm. "I saw you," she said at last, her words slow, knowing he might not understand, but speaking anyway. "Before the temple, before the capture. In the flames, I saw you stand where no one has stood." He didn't know her language, but her tone was enough to tell him she wasn't speaking lightly. There was weight in her voice, the kind that came from belief so strong it could not be shaken. When she finished binding his arm, she sat back on her heels. The forest around them was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the soft murmur of the stream. The human took a slow breath. "You risked your life," he said. "For me, we don't even know each other." She tilted her head slightly, as though studying him. "We will," she replied in her tongue, the words soft but certain. He didn't answer. But in that moment, something passed between them, something unspoken. She reached into her robes and drew out a small crystal. The same one she had placed on his chest in the temple. It glowed faintly in her palm, the light pulsing like a heartbeat. She held it out to him. He stared at it, then looked back at her. "This means you live," she said. "While it glows, no blade meant to kill you will touch you. But if it fades..." She let the thought hang. He understood enough to know it was a promise and a warning. Carefully, he closed his hand around the crystal. It was warm, as if it had been waiting for him. She watched him for a long moment, then turned her gaze to the forest. "We cannot stay here," she said quietly. "They will follow until one of us is dead." He nodded, pushing himself to his feet despite the ache in his body. They began moving again, following the stream deeper into the woods. She led the way, her steps silent on the soft ground. He followed close, the crystal clutched in his hand. Hours passed in the shifting moonlight. The forest thickened, the trees twisting together above them. Somewhere in the distance, an owl-like cry echoed through the night. At last, they stopped in a clearing surrounded by ancient stone ruins, remnants of a time even older than her people's history. The moss-covered walls offered shelter from the wind, and the overgrown archways hid them from view. "This place is forgotten," she said. "We can rest until dawn." The human sank down against a stone pillar, his body grateful for the pause. She sat across from him, watching the glow of the crystal in his hand. "You are not like them," he said after a while. She raised an eyebrow. "Them? Your people," he clarified. "You don't look at me like I'm prey." Her lips curved into the smallest of smiles. "Perhaps you are not." Silence settled over them again, but it wasn't the heavy silence of the temple. This was softer, almost fragile, as if it could break at the wrong word. In the distance, a branch snapped. Both their heads turned sharply toward the sound. Her hand went to the dagger hidden in her robe. "They've found us?" The human rose to his feet, his muscles tense. He had no weapon, but he had fought with less. The prophetess stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the ruins. Whatever came out of the darkness, they would face it together. The night air was colder now, carrying the faint metallic scent of rain. The clearing lay in near darkness, the twin moons hidden behind drifting clouds. The ruins around them seemed older than time itself, their moss-covered stones heavy with forgotten stories. The prophetess stood still, her head tilted, listening. The human's eyes scanned the tree line, his heartbeat steady but strong. Somewhere in the shadows, something moved light enough to be stealth, deliberate enough to be pursuit. A shape emerged between the trees, an alien warrior in dark armor, his blade drawn and gleaming in the pale light. Behind him, two more figures slipped silently into the clearing. Their movements were cautious but confident. They thought their prey was cornered. The prophetess stepped forward, placing herself between the human and the intruders. Her golden robe whispered against the grass as she drew her dagger. The lead warrior spoke in their tongue, his voice cold. "The council demands the human. Stand aside." Her voice was calm, but the edge beneath it was sharp as steel. "The stars chose him. You will not touch him." The warrior spread out, circling. The human tightened his grip on the crystal in his palm, its faint glow warming his skin. He didn't understand their words, but he understood the tone. There would be no walking away. The lead warrior lunged first. The prophetess met his strike, her dagger catching the light as it deflected his blade. The clash rang out in the night, shattering the stillness. The human moved without thinking, his body driven by instinct. He grabbed a loose length of stone from the fallen wall and swung it hard, catching one of the flanking warriors in the side. The alien stumbled, his weapon slipping from his hand. The third warrior rushed the prophetess from behind. The human saw it and stepped in, taking the strike meant for her. The blade bit into his shoulder, sending a shock of pain through him. He staggered, but his grip on the stone didn't loosen. He swung again, forcing the attacker back. The prophetess's eyes widened. He had taken a wound for her. For a moment, the vision she'd seen in the flames flashed in her mind, him at her side, standing against the darkness. With a sharp cry, she moved in, her dagger slicing across the lead warrior's arm. He dropped his blade, hissing in pain. The others hesitated, glancing at each other. They had not expected resistance. The human stepped forward, blood soaking his torn armor, but his stance unbroken. He looked each of them in the eye, his message wordless but clear. If they wanted him, they would have to kill him. The warriors exchanged a silent decision. The lead one spat on the ground, then gestured for the others to fall back. "This is not over," he said, and they slipped back into the trees, vanishing into the shadows they had come from. Silence returned to the clearing, broken only by the human's heavy breathing. The prophetess moved to his side, her hands quickly checking the wound on his shoulder. "You're bleeding," she murmured, her voice a mix of frustration and a soft something softer. He gave a small, pained smile. "Better me than you." She paused, meeting his gaze. In that moment, she understood the bond between them was no longer just her vision. It was real, forged in blood and defiance. They sat in the ruins until the first light of dawn touched the treetops. The clouds thinned and the moons faded into the pale sky. Birds began to stir, their soft calls filling the morning air. The prophetess knew they couldn't stay here. The council would send more hunters, and each one would be harder to evade. But she also knew the path ahead had shifted. This was no longer about saving one man's life. This was about the future of both their peoples. She stood, offering her hand to him. "Come," she said simply. He took it without hesitation. They moved together through the forest, following the stream toward the mountains on the horizon. Each step carried them further from the city and deeper into the unknown. The crystal in his hand pulsed faintly, its glow steady, as if the stars themselves were watching. Somewhere out there, In the space between worlds, war still burned. But here, in the shadow of the trees, a new fate had begun, one written not by ancient laws or blood sacrifices, but by the choices of a human warrior and an alien prophetess who had dared to defy everything. And for the first time, both believed they might just survive it.